Hello, and welcome to the third session in the series Climate Justice, Decolonizing Decarbonisation. Today, we'll be looking at systems and structures for decarbonising the university. My name is David Cross. I'm an artist and reader in art at the University of the Arts, London. Climate justice is a vital ideal. But at the point where the movements for decolonisation and decarbonisation converge, it is both unstable and contested. So my colleague Rahul Patel and I have put together these discussions to ask, how might transformative pedagogies and anti-racist practices help to integrate regenerative ecologies and restorative justice? At UAL, our President and Vice-Chancellor, James Purnell, has made climate justice key to the university's new mission of social purpose. These climate justice discussions are hosted by the School of Fine Art of Camberwell, Chelsea and Wimbledon colleges at UAL, in partnership with the Council for Higher Education in Art and Design. Our special thanks go to Anna Maloney, Director of Membership and Operations, and Sandra Booth, Director of Policy and External Relations at CHEED, for all their hard work and invaluable support in making this series happen. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you, David. So I'm Anna Maloney. I'm the Director of Membership and Operations at the Council for Higher Education in Art and Design, CHEED. So CHEED is a membership body representing art, design, creative media and related disciplines in higher education. And we have over 65 institutional members in the UK 4 nations. As David said, we've been working with David and Rahul to deliver the Climate Justice Decolonizing Decarbonisation series. And the discussions within this series aim to develop understanding of climate justice, and especially how art and design education can contribute to cultural transformation. And we hope we can continue these discussions with our members in the coming months. So just a few notes around housekeeping. We will be recording today's session. We decided to record the series to allow participants to revisit sessions and also those unable to join us to access the full series. Please familiarise yourself with CHEED's privacy policy, a copy of which is available on the website. We will be posting chat guidelines in the chat to guide participation. And for those of you on Twitter, we'll be using the series hashtag ClimateJusticeHE. We'll be starting with brief presentations from each of our speakers, whose biographies you'll see in the chat. Please, can we ask you to keep your mics and cameras off whilst the presenters are speaking, and to put your questions in the chat. We'll discuss them after the break in the open discussion. So I'll now hand back to David Cross to introduce the session.
Thanks, Anna. Justice must be based on legitimacy, and climate justice is no exception. So the procedures for making climate justice decisions, such as around sharing the global carbon budget, reparations for climate loss and damage, debt relief, and climate financing, should be inclusive and accountable. And as we all know, justice must be seen to be done. So climate justice decisions must be transparent and proportionate, allowing clear comparison between different pathways down to zero carbon. So to explore what these principles mean in practice for creative universities, today we're going to hear from people taking structural and systemic approaches to decarbonising higher education. Our first speaker today is Veronica A*Amon, who's a change maker at London College of Communication. Her biography will be in the chat and it'll be available as part of the recording, but I'd like to now pass directly to you, Veronica.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Veronica A*Amon. I'm alumnus of UAL London College of Communication, having graduated in 2019 from BA Design for Art Direction. I now work as a researcher and maker with a rhizomatic art practice, having worked for art institutions, in academic settings, and also for art studios. I am an LCC change maker for branding design and innovation and have been for the last year. My introduction to climate justice was through my connections to Uganda. My mother always commented on the lack of stable horticultural practices in several regions, despite Uganda's fertile land and for the most part idyllic climate. Within this, I began to explore practices lost to colonial legacy and destabilization to enable extraction. This in contrast to my experience with the UK and my personal limits to green spaces enabled urgent and important insights. Furthermore, my experience of having visited Uganda and seeing how textile waste, or rather secondhand clothing in busier cities and districts was handled, made me question how the view issues surrounding waste, and in doing so harm landscapes and industries of countries outside of these borders. So I was specifically raised in West London, Notting Hill, which is an interesting space in regards to its distribution of natural spaces, in contrast to within the borough, but also outside of that. And it made me also look at how our mental health is affected by these limitations, and looking into just kind of how the borough, Kensington and Chelsea, distributes these spaces in terms of private land. So looking at these two very different spaces, so from my experience of visiting Uganda yearly, it just made me think of how, as diaspora, I'm constantly exploring where I sit in regards to decolonial and climate-centered discourses, and the privileges to be able to hear these perspectives of those on the native land, and also the diaspora. So these two different spaces allow me to think about how the global north and the global south engage with each other in regards to climate issues. So what are LCC changemakers, and how have the experience I've outlined before mentioned led me to where I am today? So LCC changemakers are employed by the university, specifically London College of Communication, to work in partnership with course teams to co-develop decolonial and anti-racist curricula and teaching practices, as well as a student experience that is inclusive and equitable and compassionate. So over the last year, I've been invited to consult, comment, and contribute to an array of conversations within LCC, specifically in terms of how we are moving towards more inclusive practices with anti-racist and decolonial discourse in its roots. These conversations happen with staff at all levels as well as students. So within this, I've been able to create a year-long workshop program with BA Design for Art Direction, which is the course I actually graduated from, alongside climate advocate Agata Slomka and Noemi Sadowska, who's the design program director. And within that, we have been able to create a series of workshops that have included topics such as knowledge preservation, both from a museum and anthropological lens, accountability in the studio, so working with the students to create manifestos about how they would like to approach these conversations, and thinking about how decoloniality, decarbonisation, and eco-social justice can sit within their practice, both in real life and in digital spaces. So now we've actually finished this series. Last week we had our last session, which was a debrief, and we found that students found it both enlightening, but also quite difficult to understand in relation to their practice. Throughout this process, we found it really important to be as transparent and open with the ways this information was received by students and also the course leaders and staff involved. So while some students who both weren't and are familiar with decolonial discourse and climate justice managed to feed this knowledge into their practice throughout the year, others have, and this is completely without judgment, not seen its relevance. This in itself is an important and valid critique of how we frame such discourse, as activism, both within and outside of the institution, is viewed in a very particular way. It is not that we expect students to then produce projects centering these conversations, but that we want to enable them to consider the ways this discourse can and will be relevant in all of their practices, both during their time of study and thereafter. So with this role and my experiences that led me here, what lies ahead? Well, honestly, I don't know. It is unsure whether my personal cynicism, which, to be honest, has moved me forward to such roles and to do the work, will be reflected in UK institutions' potential inability to sustain these roles, such as this one, but I am hopeful and willing to explore what could lie ahead if they do. So, the future of student and staff partnerships. Having these countercultural conversations within institutions that are part of the current architectures of society is complex, messy, and can often be exhausting, if I'm being completely honest. So thinking of how the university continues to make meaningful student-staff partnerships is important. How do we navigate co-option of these discourses within the context of Western education systems? How do we navigate co-creation in spaces with such diverse needs, meaning international students, people from different walks of life, different, for lack of better words, stratification in society? How do we make it so that these conversations are relevant and happening for them? So I'll leave these questions for you to mull over, but my hope is that the leadership of people and staff like Lucy Panesar, who leads the LCC Changemakers, is that these difficult and complex roles will continue to find their way into these institutional spaces, both intentionally and organically, finding their form to create impact both within and outside of the university. So I hope that cross-collaboration can happen both in these academic spaces, while also redistribution of wealth, knowledge, dissemination can happen for DIY spaces or collectives, or countercultural like institutions can be supported and create really intentional and beneficial ecosystem of thought. Okay, so with all of this being said, I wanted to share some resources that have both brought me towards these conversations while also carrying me through them. I meditate with them, challenge them. Sometimes I even feel alienated by them, but they're all extremely valuable. So I don't want to assume, but I hope that's, for the most part, some of you have heard of some of these resources. So Black Skin, White Masks was very much an entry point for me in terms of decolonial thought. Finding Our Way by Prentice Hemphill was a really beautiful audio podcast, which I listened to during the last year to think about how we take embodiment practices into education. And From What If to What Next is a really great podcast, which looks at how we think hopefully and speculatively and the things we can put into practice to make these things happen. And yeah, these are just some films in relation to how I grew up and the landscapes I was surrounded with, also trying to make it more international. So Felicia was a really good short film I watched, which looks at the day of a life of a teenager in a very specific neighborhood. While I am completely unsure of what the future holds in regards to the way we approach climate justice, decoloniality, and all its many intersections in the university, I hope for funding, more resources, redistribution of wealth, and staff-student relationships based on trust to be fruitful, to enable research spaces and groups to populate both the university and outside of that. So yeah, that's all from me. I'm very aware that that was maybe quite heavy. I hope I didn't speak too fast. But yeah, there's my email if you want to connect in regards to LCC changemaking, but also my personal practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. That was fantastic, really rich. I'm so glad you could join us today. And I'm very interested in the fact that you described the changemakers as being not simply inclusive and equitable, which is where I've put the pressure, but compassionate. That's a very helpful contribution you've made to our discussion about the ethos of climate justice within art and design education.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Meg Baker of the Universities and Colleges Union. We've been discussing a range of systems and structures from the Green New Deal through to policies more focused on decarbonisation and decolonisation. As previously, Meg's biography will be in the chat, but I'd like to pass directly to you now, Meg.
Thanks, David. And I feel like I've got some very big shoes to fill going straight after Veronica. So thank you, Veronica, for sharing your own personal experiences and like making it so, yeah, touchable and understandable so that people can really connect with what you're talking about. So I'm going to talk about UCU's model claim for universities and colleges to bargain and negotiate with their employers for a Green New Deal, but with a framing focused on decarbonising and decolonising as a means of working towards and progressing work towards climate justice. We don't know what that looks like, but this is a model claim aimed to bring both the workforce and the student movement together to mobilise in partnership and collaboration, which is like perfect to follow on from Veronica in that respect, because this is all about collaboration and partnerships in order to mobilise and organise for a collective voice in order to achieve, or at least to start progress towards working for a more climate just education system in our universities and colleges. This framework was actually developed in partnership between SOS UK, the UCU, our campaigns that are hosted by SOS UK. It's a framework that has been collectively created, as well as providing a framework for collective bargaining. To start with a bit of definition of what this actually means to us, given this is a collective framework, we share definitions and understandings. I really am not keen on the idea of calling this a definition because it seems a bit too solid and permanent, whereas I'd rather see it as like a current understanding or interpretation of decarbonising. So this comes from SOS UK. So decarbonising our education system means transforming how and what we learn so that education sufficiently addresses and prepares students for the climate crisis and ecological emergency. That means that our curriculum must equip students with the knowledge, skills, attributes and values to tackle the reformation of our currently carbon-intense economic system. Furthermore, it means thinking critically and challenging the influence of corporations like fossil fuel companies in our research, funding and sponsorship. As I said, definitions have their flaws. This definition lacks the recognition that actually our operations in our education institutions are also often heavily carbon intensive. And so I'd like to acknowledge that that's missing from this current understanding of decarbonising, but I'll talk more about that later. In terms of decolonising education, we've taken this, and this is a quote from Sophia Ackel, who's described decolonising education as often understood as the process in which we think, rethink, reframe and reconstruct the curricula and research that preserve the Europe-centric colonial lens. It should not be mistaken for diversification, because diversity can still exist within this Western bias. Decolonisation goes further and deeper in challenging the institutional hierarchy and monopoly of knowledge, moving out of a Western framework. So this is really important that we recognise that. A bit of background on UCU's climate and sustainability work. In 2019, this really started to gather pace. And so building capacity and organising for power for collective bargaining within workspaces was really framed within the UCU's Green New Deal for colleges and university. And actually this decarbonising and decolonising framework, again, builds on that Green New Deal for colleges and universities. And it's about having a structured framework that the workforce can use to mobilise together in collaboration with the student movement to call upon employers to work towards climate justice in terms of how our education institutions operate and what they deliver on in terms of their education. Alongside this, UCU have developed broader awareness of climate justice and education for sustainable development through the provision of UCU's free member CPD workshops, which have been massive. We've had a huge amount of engagement, and actually these sustainability and climate justice workshops are led by and delivered by SOS UK, and they focus on decolonising and decarbonising education. They provide an introduction to climate education and sustainability, and there's a workshop on running climate themed learning events within education institutions. We've also been working to develop capacity and awareness via social dialogue and campaigning, and this has been seen through things like UCU's campaign tool for running climate-themed learning events, just to raise awareness and get people started on that journey to embed climate and sustainability into their teaching and learning across all areas of learning. We've also been working with other unions and political lobbying around linking up with industrial action and education strategies in the UK to ensure that a really joined up approach is taken. So what's climate justice? Climate justice is the moral, social and political side of the climate crisis, understanding that certain communities and minorities will face different and more damaging consequences of climate change sooner and harsher than others. So why can't we decarbonise without also decolonising? I think this is really important to recognise and acknowledge. Efforts to address environmental and climate action must also deliver on issues of justice. We can't have one without the other, otherwise we won't be achieving climate justice and we'll just be replicating the colonial and imperial past and their legacies, which have stunted the economic capacity and social capital of many in the global south and often Black and brown communities in the global north, which in turn has limited their ability to respond to the climate crisis and continues to do so. In order to address the climate crisis, we need to address the very systems that have contributed to its origins, and our education system is part of this, which is why we, ECU, are calling to both decolonise and decarbonise the education sector. We need to reform the entire education system by embedding sustainability as a core principle of every single discipline, linking this to learning about our colonial past and its hand in creating the climate crisis. This is a quote from a student at Teach the Future, who's also said that the climate crisis is a racist crisis. Climate impacts are disproportionately felt by Black and brown communities due to structures retained from colonialism, which is why we need to do this process of decolonising our education institutions. So what are we asking branches to do? UCU branches are being asked to pick up the decarbonising and decolonising bargaining claim strategy that will be spearheaded by local UCU and student union branches to build power in their institutions and their local communities to organise around these key issues with a view to submitting bargaining claims to their employers via consultation and negotiating structures. It calls upon employers through making demands on issues of climate justice for substantial and far-reaching changes by 2030. We've got 2030 as a target date, and this is taken from UNESCO's targets around education for sustainable development to be integrated by 2030, which is highly ambitious. So education for sustainable development is seen as a key enabler for the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. This has been described by UNESCO as education for sustainable development empowers learners to take informed decisions and responsible actions for environmental integrity, economic viability, and a just society for present and future generations, while respecting cultural diversity. It's also about lifelong learning and is an integral part of quality education. ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, is holistic and transformational education, which addresses learning content and outcomes, pedagogy, and the learning environment. So it's very holistic. ESD is seen as a key enabler for delivering on the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And likewise, it does have potential to deliver on climate justice if picked up and utilised in a really meaningful way. It connects with the 2030 goals by the United Nations to deliver on sustainable development goals, which were agreed by all UN member states in Paris in 2015. And ESD is an integral component of SDG number 4, which is quality education. So far, very little commitment has been made for implementation in the UK. And so we're calling on UCU branches to pick this up and demand on really tangible, realistic action at institution levels. This is just an infographic demonstrating how this bargaining and negotiation framework works in practice in terms of how branch members, so the workforce, in partnership with their students' unions, can organise and mobilise together in a really meaningful way. So the first stage would be to review and organise what's already happening in the branch. Secondly, to decide on what the branch wants to prioritise based on identifying low-hanging fruit, those things that can be addressed more quickly and more tangible, and those things which will have the highest impact. The third stage is to submit your claim in the form of a letter to your employer and request for a date for a meeting, put this on the agenda and have a time frame for response. Fourth is to negotiate and publicize the claim so that it's transparent, people are aware of it, raises awareness and could gather more momentum and gather the workforce's engagement with this. The fifth is to step up pressure, ensure that there's no greenwashing from the employer so that you build leverage for your campaign and you can increase social media posts within this part of the action. And the sixth is to continually monitor and review progress in relation to the claim. And it kind of goes on and on, it's a cycle. Okay, so we've got four main aspects to the framework. And so that's four different areas of negotiating and bargaining with the employer. The first area is teaching, learning and research. The second is representation, progression and achievement. The third is operations and estate. And the fourth is ethical finance and banking. And this is recognizing that we need a whole institution approach. And we use collective bargaining, which is the voice of students and the workforce, to call for delivery on this, to ensure that no part of an education institution is missed when we're working towards delivering on climate justice within our education institutions. So I'm going to quickly talk you through those. It's quite a lot, but there's more information on all areas of this on the UC web pages. So the first area, teaching, learning and research. This is about a demand for a whole institution approach, covering all areas of learning within our education institutions, realizing that learning doesn't just happen in the formal curriculum, so in like lectures and seminars and assessed areas of the curriculum, but also through informal extracurricular activities and in the subliminal learning spaces, which is often the culture of an organization. And it could be things such as HR practices. So it really does cover all aspects of institutional practice, including research, funding, libraries, IT services, and the Students' Union. Don't be limited by that list. There's more to it than that. It's also about negotiating policy for implementing education for sustainability across all of the curriculum by 2030, with a view to embedding democratic and participatory learning approaches across all disciplines at all levels, which really touches upon what Veronica was talking about ensuring that we've got a co-creation approach to doing this, which is where the democratic and participatory learning approaches are absolutely key. So just building on that teaching, learning and research demands, in order to actually deliver on this, we need to ensure that there's staff training and support. It's one thing to have a policy that provides a top-down accountability to having sustainability in all areas of learning, but we also need to ensure that staff are provided with the training and support to incorporate social justice, ethics and well-being and decarbonising and climate education into their teaching, learning and assessment with relevance to the context of the courses that they're teaching on. We're also calling on the employer to, in partnership with the workforce and the students, to agree a joint statement on staff resourcing and capacity to recognise the necessary changes to actually deliver on this. So yeah, you need the training and support, but there's also capacity needs there and resourcing needs to be able to have the time and the training and the confidence to be able to embed and deliver on these curriculum changes. Secondly, whistle-stop tour, representation, progression and achievement. This is about establishing a time-limited decolonising commission. The commission should have a trade union, student union and local community involvement to ensure that this is a collaborative effort and that we have collective voice in this bargaining process. The Commission aims to conduct a systematic review of representation within the institution, and it should include things like governance structures, power relations across the whole institution, staff and students. It also aims to look at progression pathways for both student and staff, to identify and assess structural barriers and or opportunities that are currently being upheld by the institution. And this should in turn address awarding gaps, sometimes described as attainment gaps, but should definitely be described as awarding gaps to put the onus on the awarding institution. And it needs to be done through a systematic review of staff and student progression rates to identify and assess structural barriers and or opportunities that again are being upheld by the institution, and with that identify ways of overcoming these. Third, operations and estate. This is about asking the employer to adopt, or if there's one in place already, to review and update a carbon management and energy plan that's inclusive of ethics and climate justice, recognising that it's not just the carbon emissions of our estate, but it's also the workforce behind the provision of our operational elements of our education estate that need to be included too and recognised. Key areas that may need to be addressed come within Scope 3 emissions and supply chain and procurement management systems. It's also about agreeing a mechanism for tracking carbon reduction performance and an annual review of progress. So this is about agreeing a mechanism for determining, measuring and evaluating the institution's handprint. So positive sustainability impacts, inclusive of social and economic factors, and to review the carbon footprint and handprint of supply chains. So it's kind of all inclusive, covering all areas of an institution's carbon. Fourth area is ethical finance and banking, and it's about ensuring that both finance and banking within our education institutions is decarbonised and decolonised. So recognising that we need to have divestment from fossil fuels, arms and unethical investments. They're all inextricably linked, and this needs to be addressed and called upon, and our employers need to be called out on this. So in terms of a call for action, UCU are calling on members and beyond their own membership to organise for power with a view to submitting decarbonise and decolonise 2030 campaigns and model claims to their employers, and to start progressing the framework within your branches. In terms of the climate learning, we do strongly advocate for educators to work in partnership with each other to host climate themed learning events as a way of raising awareness and sort of trialing the first steps of embedding sustainability and climate into their education provision. And that could be in the formal, informal and subliminal curriculum. There's loads of info on the web pages. I'm going to leave it at that for now, but thank you for listening to me.
Meg, thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. A comprehensive and integrated vision, but absolute credit to you for coping with the background noise there. It was almost funny at some points, but it brought to mind the need to stay focused despite all the troubles and interruptions of everyday life. I particularly want to commend your whole institution approach, which strikes me as vital. We put so much time and effort into focusing on the theoretical and creative engagement, but it's vital to practice what we preach and walk the walk. Integrating what we say with what we do is a key part of the hidden curriculum, the culture of the learning environment that students pick up on. Your presentation was absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And we'll be coming back to you for some advice in the future, I'm sure. Our next speaker is Akhil Kapasi, who is the Senior Project Manager responsible for ethical supply chains at SOS UK, Students Organising for Sustainability UK. So Akhil, over to you.
Okay, so yeah, a bit of background about SOS UK, where I'm from. It stands for Students Organising for Sustainability UK, and we're a UK-based charity. We launched in October 2019. We used to be part of NUS, and we're now an independent charity, but still very much part of the wider NUS family, which, as we know, represents millions of students. So our kind of three main aims are getting more students leading on and learning about sustainability. We know students have power, and we also know that sustainability isn't really taught enough in the curriculum and in other spaces. So equally with our second aim, we're about embedding sustainability in formal education from early years to adult learning. So it's not just limited to things like geography or the sciences. And finally, making sustainability more inclusive, so everyone feels like it's something for them and that they can take action on it, is really, really important. So just before I kind of go into some of the detail, kind of one of the cases for structural change is that students care, and they increasingly care. So this is a bit of a complicated graph, but essentially you're looking at the blue line in the middle. And you can see from 2014 on the left to 2019 on the right, that's steadily gone up. So to the point where in 2019, over 1,000 students that we surveyed said they were very or fairly concerned about climate change. So there are, of course, many of the reasons, as we've heard today and we'll hear, that we need to take drastic action, but students increasingly caring adds further weight to the argument. And this quote from the UNESCO chair, that 6% of people attend university, but then take up 80% of the leadership positions. It shows the power universities and their graduates have to influence. You know, clearly there's inequalities in that statement and sort of which type of education gets standing in our society. But nonetheless, this is a situation right now, and it shows the power that universities have. So decarbonising, I mean, Meg helpfully went through this. So, I mean, just to summarise, you know, we can look at it from a narrow angle in terms of removing carbon, but we believe, particularly as an educational charity, that, you know, we need to go beyond this. That's really crucial, kind of reducing emissions and looking at the structures, but also looking at other areas of influence, particularly our education system. So what we're learning, how we're learning, the content of the education, and the way it's taught, given particularly from sort of younger ages, where we know that can influence how we end up in life. Equipping students with the skills, acknowledging that there is a climate and ecological emergency, the world will be different, and giving them the skills to take action on that and cope with it. And finally, I'll touch on this in more detail shortly, but thinking critically and challenging the influence of corporations like fossil fuel companies and arms companies in our research, funding and sponsorship. Often what the rest of society, education sector can be leaders, but in some spaces, and we see this in sustainability in some ways, what the kind of big corporates and the private sector can do can somehow filter into some of the language and actions that we take in the education sector, and we should just be aware of that. So practically, some of the areas of impact that a university can have. We'll start on the top left there, estates. So we're talking about buildings on campuses mostly here, and there's a lot of carbon emissions from them due to the energy use. Also, as universities strive to kind of attract the best students and staff, you know, we see new buildings being constructed all the time as well. So there is a big impact there, and a continuing impact, not only from the construction and renovation, but from the day-to-day use. In the middle, education, as I've said, what and how we teach, and embedding it within all types of our curriculum. On the right, money. You know, universities are about teaching, but especially in an age of tuition fees and other investments they have, they can accumulate lots of money, and often that is invested. And also there are large amounts of pensions provided to all the staff. So there's a big amount of money there that can be either put into good stuff or bad stuff, and we'll come on to that. And who does a university legitimize by taking money from? So here we're thinking about like corporate partnerships and funding as well. The bottom left is sometimes lesser known, but you can walk across the entire country on university land. That's across the sector. That's how much universities have in terms of land. Of course, some will have more than others, but ultimately how that is used is really important, and specifically from transitioning away from intensive agriculture to more nature-friendly farming methods, also sometimes called regenerative agriculture. And lastly, people. Universities have a big influence over them. So we're looking at staff, students, the local community. The question is, how do we encourage and influence behaviour change in people to complement the wider infrastructure and societal changes? So, you know, in our work, that can be everything from buying less fast fashion, for example, to using less energy in halls of residence. Thinking about zooming out a bit, as we've kind of touched on, the modern world, particularly, you know, in the West, is built on intensive carbon use. You know, everything from our energy systems to how we transport people, to the internet, to how we shop. It's all based on carbon. We know this kind of use and these kind of systems is having a disproportionate impact on the rest of the world, particularly in the global South and people of colour. So radical change is needed. So what is system change? In our mind, it's about addressing the root causes of the complex and interrelated challenges we face. So that's at a local scale and a global scale. Now, today we're focusing on climate injustice, but I think, as Veronica touched on as well, it's important to remember that there are these kind of systemic issues underpinning climate justice also perpetuate other social injustices, for example, poverty. So if we kind of take action for climate justice, you know, there will be benefits in other spaces, and it's important to try and link those up wherever possible, especially if we're looking at structural change. And of course, you know, there needs to be government and kind of business changes at national, international levels. You know, they've got a massive part to play, but that doesn't mean to say universities can't still do their bit. And that's both radically changing themselves and lobbying for wider action. On the point about individual change, you know, there are plenty of decarbonisation initiatives looking at individual change, so what students do, what their behaviours are. Now, there really is a place for that, and that's important, but it's important to be cautious of that and ultimately tackle the structural changes. You know, it's the fossil fuel companies, some of the carbon footprint calculators that we increasingly see, their inception was actually funded by one of the prominent fossil fuel companies. So it's in their interest to slow the change down and keep us sort of pointing fingers at each other as individuals, rather than looking at some of the structural things that need to be changed. So they're both important, but certainly not just an overfocus of individual change. That would definitely be not where we need to be. So at SOS, one of the key tools we're using to stimulate decarbonisation at universities is our carbon targets campaign. So we're calling on UK universities to publicly commit to being net zero emissions for scopes 1, 2 and 3 by 2030. So within 12 months of the commitment, there should be a fully developed plan in place as well, looking at the emissions reduction curve. And offsetting, which I'm going to come on to, should only be done as an absolute last resort and only for scope 3 emissions. A note about scope 3, they're generally known as other indirect emissions, and as a result, they kind of are used in greenwashing. You know, there may be a company or indeed a university that comes out and says we're net zero, we're doing great things, but sometimes that can exclude scope 3 emissions. Now that's important because it covers things like waste management, student travel, staff travel, procurement, investments and agricultural land holdings. So it can often be a massive proportion of total emissions. So it's important that any target includes scope 3. And offsetting should not be used as a way for institutions to shift the burden of their emissions to other countries whilst continuing business as usual in the UK. Often things like tree planting or cleaner cooking stoves, the action isn't taken in these parts of the world, in Europe, in America. They're often taken in the global south. And that there's a real disconnect there, especially if we're thinking about decolonising as well, where the people who have had the least impact are still expected to kind of make those changes, while the richer world kind of continue as usual. So real zero, having said all of that, there is a place in principle for net zero, but what the reality is, what we're seeing is a lot of corporations are co-opting this term to basically continue business as usual. So on the left there, Greenpeace have come out with a real zero campaign, which is basically saying don't offset, reduce absolute emissions and stop offsetting. We need to stop carbon emissions before they're put into the atmosphere, rather than continuing it and then just paying for offsets. There's a lot of clever accounting tricks out there, which I don't have the time to go into detail. On the right there, it's also being championed, the Real Zero initiatives, by Global South-led groups. For example, that photo is of an Oil Watch International Conference from their global gathering last year in Nigeria. And they too are calling that these, what they say is net zero and other false solutions are allowing polluters to continue locking in extractive and other obnoxious activities that empower the fossil fuel industry. And also, they say it stifles the need to talk about a just global carbon budget, and indeed climate reparations as well, and a global just transition. So some of these tactics are slowing the change down. Briefly, some popular companies on the left there. JBS, people know less about generally. That's one of the biggest meat companies in the world. That's contributing to deforestation in Amazon and in other places. Of course, as we know, meat and dairy are big contributors to the climate crisis as well. But in essence, to put this into perspective, Nestle, Eni and Shell, Eni is a big energy company. Just these three companies will need about 20 million hectares per year for their collective offset needs. That's an area roughly the size of all the forested lands in Malaysia every single year. So it's simply unsustainable for university and other sectors to follow this same logic. So we need to think of something else. That photo of a protest sort of it cleverly links both decolonisation and decarbonisation together and how important they are. Of course, touching on climate profits at the bottom there, it's also looking at demarketisation. So actually, you know, this incessant need we have for kind of profit at all costs, particularly in this part of the world. Coincidentally, I've got a positive example from the art sector to show. Some of you might be aware already of the Gallery Climate Coalition, and they're an international collective of commercial art galleries. They're actually advising their members to avoid conventional offsets completely and instead decarbonise the sector by directly supporting groups to keep fossil fuels in the ground, defend or preserve forests, and shift towards regenerative agriculture. So instead of paying something, so for example, planting trees in another country and kicking it in the long grass, they're actually saying, well, why don't we instead use that money to make radical change in the here and now and support other groups? So similarly, a university could look at supporting transformational projects with that, rather than potentially disingenuously claiming that a net zero target, which heavily relies on offsetting, is actually sustainable, which, as we've heard from other groups, is very debatable. But even these sort of solutions, it really isn't, particularly in this part of the world, not meant to be slowing down or watering down the need to reduce absolute emissions. It's just to present a more effective, immediate solution rather than kind of pretending everything is sustainable using offsets. Some kind of tangible things that students or indeed staff might want to take a look at. So where universities have carbon impact is not immediately obvious. So I'm just going to touch on three things there before I close. The first one is careers. So where graduates go and work has a massive impact, and a university has influence over that. You know, fossil fuel companies, fossil fuel funding banks, they are still big recruiters of graduates, and that's a big problem. Research on the left, universities still take money from big polluters to fund research. Often that's a PR move because a big oil company may actually look better because they're funding some renewable research. But again, the devil's in the detail, and often they might not actually use that research, or it might just be a very small proportion of money they're putting into that while still building new pipelines in the global south. And governance, what about the university's business schools? What about their governing bodies? We've got a new campaign coming out next month, but it's going to look at how many prominent universities actually have senior bank figures, senior weapons company figures on very influential boards at the university. And we have to ask the question, what part is that playing? And finally, investments. Universities, through their pension provider, continue to financially invest in these companies, whether that's fossil fuels, whether that's weapons, whether that's massive meat companies. And this can be traced back to students' money. A student might be giving money in good faith, but actually behind the scenes, whether that's through the university's pension scheme or their own investments, are actually funding destructive areas. And so those three areas have culminated in the form of tangible campaigns, and I'll put a link in the chat to them shortly. So fossil-free research is over 500 academics have signed an open letter for this. And it's a coalition of academics, climate experts, and university members working to end the influence of fossil fuel money on climate change research. The middle one is a People and Planet campaign, and they're looking at lobbying careers departments to stop promoting oil, gas, and mining companies, whether that's on their careers platforms, whether that's on their careers fairs. And finally, Invest for Change, that's an SOS UK campaign, and that is looking at channeling university investments into more sustainable areas, looking at getting them into an ethical investment policy, looking at not just putting in divesting from fossil fuels and keeping it in a neutral or indeed another worse place. So from fossil fuels to arms, you know, that's still a problem when we talk about decolonization or decarbonisation indeed, but actually channeling that into positive areas like renewable energy and community housing, for example. And finally, I guess this is zooming out a lot more, but you know, we know that marketization of the education system and tuition fee hikes has resulted in greater inequality in education. This has meant the lack of the decrease in funding has meant universities are seeking other sources of income and ways of expansion. In some cases, for example, new campuses abroad are being seen, including the Global South. Now, obviously, there are much greater polluting industries in the world than the education sector, but ultimately, how sustainable is this underpinning growth logic if we're talking about structural change, that is, given it invariably means ever greater resource use on a planet with finite resources? So it is a much bigger structural question that also needs to factor in a just transition, as we heard from Meg. But to what extent, especially in a richer country like the UK, where we've already developed to a certain degree, do we need to continue expanding, particularly when that expansion is centered around economic growth and profit? And I think the question can also be posed in the education sector as well. Thank you very much. I'll put the link in the chat of all the resources.
Akil, that was amazing. Thank you so much. And that last point you made about expansion is something that we do face here at the University of the Arts London, where we have a new vision of doubling student numbers over the coming decade, whilst also getting to net zero carbon. And I think the questions that raises are very, very complex, because if it's simply about expanding in order to grow the balance sheet, and it's essentially based on fossil fuels, then it's deeply problematic. But if it's a change in the way that we teach and the people that we teach, so we genuinely reach out to other countries and exchange knowledge in a two-way process, perhaps if it's centered around sustainability and ecological regeneration and restorative justice, that could be a really good thing. So I suffer from terrible climate anxiety, but it's been great to hear your assessment there of the concrete steps forward, some of the structures that we can build and develop. But to comment on this and other points, and to give us another perspective on the whole debate, we'd now like to hear from Professor Jeremy Till, who is Pro-Vice Chancellor of University of the Arts London and has done great work as University Lead on Climate Emergency. So Jeremy, if you're with us, it's over to you.
I'm here, and I've got huge guilt because I think I misread the brief, and therefore what I'm going to talk about is going to be rather different than the three brilliant presentations, but in a way I'm quite glad, because I'm not sure I could have actually done very much more than the first three in setting a kind of strong context for what universities should do. And all I can say is that UAL will be publishing a climate action plan in September, which we will now go and look at these new resources in order that we can supplement that. So my talk, I'm afraid, is rather different, because I'm going to talk about science. I'm going to talk about both the strength and the limits of science, to assert both the essential role that science plays in the understanding of the climate emergency, but also then to assert the limits of science and why, and this may be the subject more for the next round of talks around what role the creative university can play. So it sounds a bit paradoxical to say we need science, but we don't need science. So let me try to do the first bit. We need to read endlessly the final sentence of the IPCC report, so I will read it to you. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. Now, the language here is very clear. Scientific evidence that global heating is human-induced and is a threat to human well-being. And if no action is taken, it's a threat to the future of a livable planet, for which one can read a threat to the future of mankind. Now, this isn't what the right-wing press call the words of climate alarmists. This is the words of the consensus of the global scientific community, signed off by their senior civil servants and government officials. This is science working at what it does best, which is take a thorough analysis of the evidence base, and through a rigorous peer review based on fallibility, reach conclusions. And those conclusions are devastating. Of course, climate skeptics, lobbyists, the carbon state, and the fossil fuel criminals have and continue to undermine and to cast doubt on this evidence, but this is unequivocal. And so on this basis, why would any university not look to science-based targets, as we've seen, to inform its actions in relation to decarbonisation? Why would it not use scientific analysis to address decarbonisation as a set of quantifiable resources? However, and this is a kind of quite big however, the scientific understanding of the symptoms, i.e. there is global heating, and then the modelling of its effects, i.e. what is going to happen down the line, and indeed of the immediate causes, there is a proliferation of greenhouse gases, is not enough. Indeed, it may be a danger in its limitations. The centrality of the scientific paradigm to the modern project in terms of progress, reason, growth and order leads to the suggestion, so I'm saying that the scientific paradigm underpins the modern project, which Akil has talked about in terms of the dangers of it, in terms of growth and the effects of that. The centrality of the scientific paradigm leads to the suggestion and then the ideology that scientific method can be used to solve the problem of the climate emergency. The modern project propounds that for progress to be made, problems need to be solved, mainly through technocratic intervention. The climate emergency is no different. It's framed as a project and a problem out of time that can be solved. This solutionist approach leads to a very reductive understanding of the situation, dealing only with those things that can be apparently fixed, but ignoring the much more complex underlying causes. And also the human dimensions of the symptoms, and in particular the structural inequalities that all the three speakers have talked about in terms of what the climate emergency does in terms of global disparities. So my first obvious point is that scientific analysis of climate is not the same as understanding the climate emergency, of its context and its formations. And in particular, it does not unravel the underlying causes, most obviously the violence of extractive capitalism and the multiple inequalities that follow. So the reliance on the scientific method and scientific targets is not enough. The second related point is that one cannot solve a problem with the same tools and paradigms that created it. The modern project's addiction to growth and progress and its resulting reliance on particular modes of thinking and acting have led inevitably to the climate emergency, in the endless extraction and exploitation of resources and people are necessary to keep the machine running. And so the clear point is that the climate emergency presents a kind of fatal threat to the paradigms and methods of the modern project, including those of simple reliance on scientific thinking. The systemic change that is required, which we've seen through the UCU Green New Deal and other things that previous speakers have talked about, cannot be found through words like adaptation and mitigation. Indeed, these in their very language are defeatist, and in some way there may even be a kind of acceptance in those, and therefore a collaboration with the forces that have created the emergency. Again, they do not deal with the underlying causes. So this is exactly where the creative university comes in. Clearly, we have to deal with the issues of decarbonisation in terms of scope 1 and 2 and 3. We have to deal with the profound challenges that Akil has thrown at us in terms of what does it mean not to offset and so on and so forth. But I think also where the creative university comes in is that we are already using methods and ways of thinking that supplement or go beyond those of scientific reason. And what I'm interested in is how one cannot abandon science, but see science alongside these other ways of thinking. As an architect, I need to know about building physics in order to produce carbon positive buildings, but that's not enough. And so within the Creative University, what one can see is a whole set of other ways of thinking and acting, which already are there as means to address the climate emergency in a manner which scientific logic alone can't. So if I take the words such as imagining, of co-creation, of contingency, and of values, then these are exactly what we are already doing. We anticipate and we imagine the future. That's what our students are doing endlessly. They're taking a small bit of the world and they're thinking about how to transform it for something better. And in that, they are imagining new scenarios and new ways of living together, in which the systemic change that the climate emergency becomes realized and imagined through the way that they produce work. The next thing is how inevitably we've moved away from the paradigm of the art school as something which is a kind of to do with individual subjectivities into a place in which what our students are doing is working with each other and working for and on behalf of others. And in that, there's a sense of co-creation. And we can only address the climate emergency not through the acts of individual experts, but through collective endeavor. And that is also what happens within the art school and within the creative education sector. The third one is to do with contingency and the way that the current crises of race and climate have, without any doubt, undermined the collective certainty on which the modern project is founded. A project based on Eurocentric values of universalism, by which their very nature are not inclusive, as Veronica so clearly talked about right at the beginning of this session. And so this idea that we can proceed through logic and reason doesn't help us address the profound uncertainties and contestations that the climate emergency and the crises of race and inequality are throwing up. Things are continually in play. Everything might be otherwise, which is the definition of contingency. And this is what happens within creative education. We don't proceed through certainty. We proceed through the asking of questions and then the negotiation of the context through challenging and understanding those contexts, but not through certainty, but through contingency. And again, this kind of sense of creative practitioners are good at negotiating uncertainty, deftly dealing with the contingencies of the world that we encounter. And again, this kind of capability is at the heart of any response that we might have to the climate emergency. And the final point is that we bring to the table in any of these negotiations with contested spaces of climate or of race, we have now to bring to the table a sense of values and ethics. Often scientific logic asserts its authority through false notions of objectivity, whereas what we do in the creative education is always, well, I think increasingly, as we saw particularly in Veronica's opening about the kind of the difficulties of some of these contestations, but by bringing an ethical horizon to the work that we do, we're able to see the climate emergency not simply as a set of figures and facts, which, as David has said, are deeply scary, but as figures and facts which have a human dimension. With that, we have to understand the response to it through an ethical and empathetic framework. So although my argument starts with the absolute need to work with science-based targets, it then moves to a position in which we assert the role that creative education can play in addressing these twin issues of decarbonisation and decolonisation. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was completely provoking and totally relevant. And I think the questions you pose for us there about the limitations of science are extremely important. As you know, I've been an advocate of science-based targets for a long time, so I take your comments extremely seriously. And I think the recognition that you brought us back to, that while science may be necessary, it's not sufficient. We have to have the humanities, we have to have creativity, and the cultural transformation goes much deeper than some technocratic project. So really rich material, very provoking and completely relevant to the discussion that will follow. But first, I'd like to propose that we have a break we're running a little bit behind time, but would a 10-minute break be okay with everybody? Excellent. Okay, well, it's now 10 past 11. If we rejoin at 11:20, we'll have a lively discussion about the interaction of these different positions. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, everybody. A lot of rich material, very provoking and insightful presentations from our contributors. Veronica, who started by bringing personal experience and raising the issues of empathy and compassion alongside those of justice. Then Meg gave us the idea of the union, the trades union, as a way of articulating shared concerns and producing a coherent vision, and then processes for collective negotiation, striking a bargain around the future in a way. Akil, with his focus on supply chains and procurement, raised the issues about the broad university as a whole institution that contains not just the academic and the research side, but also the management, the operations and estates. So the idea of a whole community of people functioning together as an organization. And then Jeremy cast doubt in a way as a provocation, a polemic on the function of science or its limitations, which I think is absolutely crucial, because an excessive reliance on numbers, measurement and calculation could lead us away from the real issue of justice, which is about judgment, where we bring in our humanity and our values, not simply our ability to quantify. And so between those different positions, I think we've got some wonderful coordinates for a discussion about how we focus our energies together. Are there any clashes or flashpoints where there might be conflict that could divide us? And what can we do as a priority to take this discussion around climate justice forward for the future? So if there's anybody who'd like to pose a question in the chat, that would be fantastic. So much the better if you'd like to actually speak it to us. But maybe one of our contributors so far would like to respond to what they've heard from their colleagues.
I suppose what I'm most interested in across the presentations is how one joins them up. That if you take Veronica's really clear analysis of how you enter these contested spaces as collaborators and you deal with them, that seems to be very much to do with the human experience and then the learning experience. And then the necessity, on the other hand, of kind of ethical procurement policies and ethical investment policies. And then I suppose the closest one might get, and I'd like maybe Meg can talk about it more, which is what is the university's Green New Deal? What is the version of the Green New Deal which is relevant to universities, which go beyond simply the kind of the quantifiable aspects? And can you, I mean, at UAL, what we've done is that we've got, I think Dilys was in the audience, so she maybe explained it better than I can. We got 4 working groups, one of which is around teaching and learning, one of which is around particularly carbon reduction, both scope 1 to scope 2, one of which is around the community and activism, and one of which is around research and advocacy. And the difficulty is to get all of these various bits of an institutional structure working together so that an understanding of scope 3 is not simply, as Akil says, very dangerous, but just to put scope 3 into a kind of quantifiable offsetting. Scope 3 is also about behavior change. It's about talking to our students about, okay, 1 flight a year we will deal with, but if you do 2, you have to deal with the second one or whatever. I mean, I've just made that up. But so it's how one gets, and I'm ready, maybe Meg can come in, about how one gets a kind of a complete systems analysis in which the various bits. So I put four circles in you know, to do a teaching research and advocacy, activism, and carbon, how one makes those as an interrelated thing is kind of where I'm really interested and need help.
Jeremy, I mean, that's a big question, but I guess the purpose of the Green New Deal framework is to do exactly what you're asking. So it is a framework that aims to capture all those different moving parts and all the different elements that need to be explored and addressed within our education institutions. And it's a big framework. The full document isn't the document that's online. UCU members can ask for it and request it, but it's not available online because it's basically the lobbying toolkit for UCU members to utilize to engage with their employers to bargain and negotiate. So you kind of don't want to have that there as something that's like really, really open source and available in that sense, but it can be shared on request, that's for sure. And it is a framework that pulls all those aspects together, but I think it's also important to recognize that it's really difficult because I predominantly work for SOS UK, and we host a program called Responsible Futures, which is a whole institution approach to embedding sustainability learning in all areas of learning within our education institutions, and there's some inclusion of research within that, but that doesn't include operations, but it has a nod towards operations in recognizing that operations, the staff that work on operations of our education institutions should ideally be also collaborating with the teaching and learning staff and the researchers to have a joined up approach to how we deliver on this and to engage students in their campuses in a really meaningful way so that they have that applied learning opportunity as part of their learning experience by engaging with their university estate in like a really, really vast range of ways in which that can happen. But I'd say it's about having those different working groups, but also having a central group which comes together at regular touch points to ensure that you're not doubling up on work, but you're actually complementing each other's work. It's about collaboration and communication and working in partnership in really meaningful ways. I hope that's answered at least part of your question.
Thanks, Meg. We've got a hand up here from Annette Nodam. Would you like to come forward and speak your question, Annette?
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm not necessarily looking for an answer, but I just thought I'd throw this point in there. One of the challenges that we have is, and this is perhaps because of the kind of university we are, so it's Birmingham City University, and we're quite a vocational university with quite a large art, design and media department, including architecture and performance. And one of the challenges we have is because of the kinds of students that we have, whilst our students are interested in social justice and sustainability, and we're doing our best to embed all of this into our curriculum, there's a degree to which our students are also interested in just getting a job. And that's fair enough. And sometimes that all works together very well, but sometimes it doesn't, in terms of the kind of pedagogies and the curriculum that we design. So there are some challenges, I think, in looking critically at questions and asking our students to do that, whilst on the other hand, also saying, to get on in work, you need to know these things and you need to adopt these practices, because we're, not in every aspect of this work, but often we come up against this kind of problem where we would like our students perhaps to engage more critically, and actually they just want to know how to do it to get a job. And there's a contradiction sometimes in the nature of current practices in the creative industries and the kinds of ethical and critical questions that we're asking in sessions like this.
I would be more optimistic because I think that, so Antonio Guterres yesterday in a UN Secretary General in an address to, I think it was an American graduation ceremony, basically said, do not go and work for the carbon criminals. So if he's saying it, I think we can say that too. And I don't think that is compromising the employability of students. Indeed, I think that if students assert and display their credentials in terms of their ethical approach to issues of climate and race, that unless you're going for a job at BP, then yeah, probably wouldn't get that one. But in many sectors, this is exactly what employers are looking for. So I would be more bullish, Annette, I think, than and try to say this is actually part of your new skill set and your new way of thinking about the world, and the world needs that.
Akil, would you like to come in and respond?
Yeah, what I'd say, yeah, I agree with Jeremy, but I get where that is coming from. I think one of the things to consider for the university in that sort of context would be not making it about that individual student or an individual student. Like, there are reasons why people join certain jobs and all the rest of it. What I think the university's role there is, one example is that fossil-free careers campaign we are mentioned from People and Planet, the idea that the structure's changing. So yes, it may take a number of years for that to filter through the change, but actually universities change their career policies, who they advertise on campus, who they platform in their partnerships and promote. Those things will then embed, and then, as a proportion, people may then tend to change. I'm not sure it would be, it probably may be disillusioning for certain groups, because obviously not everybody cares about the issues we're talking about. So it could end up disillusioned if it was pointing the finger, or those. I mean, it's certainly not the approach we take as SOS, because we think it's more constructive to work with them. But certainly, yeah, the carbon criminal, that is an optimistic thing that the Secretary General said, Jeremy. So I think we should work with that and just try and change some of the platforms.
Thanks, Akil. That's very helpful. We've got a question in the chat here from Chris Fremantle. Does the Green New Deal for universities imagine a fundamentally different business model, one that affects the funding councils as well as the individual institutions, for example, the values as well as the processes? Would anybody like to respond to that? Perhaps that's directed your way, Meg.
Yeah, there's a couple of Green New Deal questions in the chat. So I did respond to that in the chat, but I'll say it so that everyone can hear as well. So the Green New Deal can definitely be picked up and kind of used by UCU members in a way in which feels fit for purpose within the context of your branch, within the values of your branch, and also like the framework of your institution, kind of the structures that you're working within. But at the same time, it can be used to kind of call for really significant structural change, and it's done in that deliberate way. So we know that branches are picking up the Green New Deal and drawing out aspects which they feel work for them, and then not necessarily picking up all elements, because it's not necessarily prescriptive, but it's a model for how branches can work together and use their voices collaboratively to call on their employers to see real change to deliver on climate justice. Yes, because where I was talking about funding and ethical finance, the Green New Deal model 100% includes looking at where your funding is coming from. But I also know that that's an area which many academics find quite challenging if they're potentially from an academic area that currently is seen as depending upon what the Green New Deal would perceive as less than ethical funding sources. And I think we need to work with academics. So actually, from a UCU stance, we're currently working on this as part of a just transition model, recognizing that the Green New Deal needs to provide a just transition model for workers who are going to be in very precarious positions as and when more direct action gets picked up by our education institutions to address the fact that they're currently doing research that's continuing to contribute to the climate and ecological crisis. And so we need to work with those members of staff, those employees, to support them in that transition, to identify the skill set that will very likely be transferable and support them to work with the employers to ensure that appropriate provision is made.
That's really helpful. And it leads us straight into a question also in the chat from Theo Hobson, who said, gathering support for initiatives like the Green New Deal can be difficult as it requires people to step out of their comfort zone, and it can make you feel uneasy as it's perceived as a little bit subversive. So how can we reassure colleagues and ease the fears they have around adopting a critical stance towards the university, or maybe by extension, the wider world that the university is part of? So systems and structures is one approach, but what about the ethos or the solidarity or the companionship that might go with taking that risk around stepping out of line and speaking out of turn?
I'll briefly talk about this, but I think I don't want to like point fingers, but I wonder if Veronica might also want to talk about this too, because this really deeply connects with like decolonizing in its very nature is subversive. It is about calling for structural change because those very structures are currently upholding systemic oppression. And so we need to be calling this out and calling for real action and real change to happen within our education institutions and stop upholding these systems and structures. However, it is very much understood that individuals may find this uncomfortable, and we need to work with them to find areas which they connect with at a personal level, at a professional level, and find ways in which they can be part of this campaigning and lobbying and advocacy work where they don't feel so uncomfortable that they disengage, but support them to become engaged. And it's about getting to know those individuals, finding the things that they connect with, and then finding those points of connect and then bring them into the campaign work rather than scaring them off.
It's good to see you here, Veronica. Would you like to respond from your perspective?
Yeah, of course. I think, like Meg said, during the course of even doing those workshops with the students, it was very much them being scared to have those conversations. I think there's an expectation that everything will be right, or you have to say the right things. And I very much made them aware that with issues such as decarbonisation, climate justice, decoloniality, anti-racism, there is no end. It is complex. I think even in terms of my personal research into decoloniality, I constantly experience frictions, but I think it's also understanding that those frictions don't negate the importance. I think my personal practice, I find a lot of gold in that friction, asking why engagement isn't happening rather than thinking about how can we make people engage more. Sometimes you just need to ask them why it's not happening, and then from that you learn about the intersections of their identities, or sometimes they just don't want to. And I think it's about allowing, I always tell my students that we are trying to enable knowing so that you then make that choice, because I think it's all good and well that we impart this knowledge. I think accountability and embodiment is where I personally sit, and what I want to make them aware that they have a choice within. But yeah, I don't know if I'm rambling, but that's kind of where I sit in terms of those conversations. They will be hard, they will be messy, and they are complex, and they do not have a conclusion. And I think we need to be comfortable with that.
That's an excellent point. And I think it corresponds to the idea or the value of critical thinking, which is one of the defining characteristics of higher education, is that people don't simply absorb information. They learn to reconcile competing views or competing claims, and to not simply take a position, a kind of balanced and stable position, but negotiate a continually shifting constellation, I suppose, of changing issues and opinions on them. So thanks for that, Veronica. That's really helpful. We have a question from Anne Toomey addressed to everybody in the panel, or listeners as well. Does the panel think that students, and particularly prospective students, are more aware, perhaps these days, of the university's collaborators, sponsors and partners? And if so, how does the panel see this affecting recruitment strategies? Well, we've got plans to expand our student cohort over time. How will a sense that students might be more aware of the university as an operation in the wider society, how might that affect the way universities recruit?
Akil, you might also want to talk about our carbon targets work a little bit on this, whether students are aware and conscious of that. But for those of you who aren't familiar, there's also the University League, the People and Planet University League, which does highlight university rankings around their progress towards sustainability and their work on sustainability. And from my time engaging with students, I do find it surprising that students do actually know about this, because students, before they go into university, some have actually looked at this, some prospective students do make their decision based on the ethics and the sustainability of the institution that they're going on to. Some look at the course content, some have left their university courses because they've been de-inspired by the course content's lack of sustainability coverage. Yeah, so I mean, it can also be from a previous role working for university, in terms of thinking about gaining leverage with your university, it can affect recruitment. If a university can demonstrate that they're making positive progress around sustainability, this can be a draw factor for students, and it should be something that institutions shout about and like communicate more widely.
Yeah, in addition to that, I mean, things like our carbon targets, the funding came out of the idea that like the People, Planet and University League students want like a way to be able to assess who they apply for even before they kind of start university. So this is just one of many different options for them to look at. I guess with recruitment, the reason why there's more of these things I was talking about, I think I mentioned our campaign that's going to start in the next couple of months, looking at cutting university ties with some of these dodgy fossil fuel companies, etc. And you know, the very idea there's more awareness around this is because historically there's been less. You know, there's maybe great campaigns on things like plastic or waste or other sort of energy saving, and they're important, but maybe less so around things that can be hidden a bit more, I guess, through the governance procedures at a university, and maybe more not so obvious ways that corporates can influence university. And I guess that's something that needs to be more done on, I think. Yeah, and stopping that license is also a social license point. The very idea of inviting the likes of HSBC or Barclays still funding fossil fuels to campuses, giving them that platform, is kind of furthering that social license for somebody to continue applying. So while those sorts of things continue, I think, and those things aren't called out by the university or students or anybody else, then there's going to be less awareness of these things, because there is quite a big social license still, I think, for oil companies and banks, etc., to operate in.
Unfortunately, there's an almost direct correlation between the perceived status of the university and how much money they take from the carbon criminals. So that Oxford, Imperial, etc., Stanford, Harvard will be taking a lot of money, and that's not going to affect their recruitment because everyone wants to go to them because of their perceived status, unless there are really clear campaigns about taking money directly, but run by students. And that's beginning to happen, but I think we just need to get more vocal.
Well, one of the things I've proposed at UAL a long time ago was that we should switch banks. So it was a provocation, but there was a serious impulse behind it, which is that part of our remit as an educational establishment is to give students a place in society, or to enable them to claim their place in society, and interact with the institutions and the processes and show their values within that. So I wonder whether, I've been interested in the way Royal Bank of Scotland, for example, has rebranded itself as NatWest. And NatWest sponsored the COP26, and they're claiming that they're using the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure in their measuring their Scope 3 emissions. So they're looking, they say, at the way they invest. I did invite them to take part in this session, but they didn't answer, unfortunately. So the dialogue couldn't go anywhere. But I wonder if in future, rather than giving them a platform to simply promote the one side of what they do, we invite them in openly and say, look, we're struggling with these issues and there's complexity here and it's not a straight shot. What's your position on coping with the criticisms as well as aiming to progress on this? So watch this space, folks. Maybe we'll speak to our bank at some point in the future, but they would need to pick up before that becomes possible. Are there any other questions? I think, Noel, you've got your hand up. Would you like to come in? You've made some great contributions in the past.
Yeah, it was just also partly to address some of there's been some comments about student anxiety around things. And I think we also kind of have to, as much as we want to kind of drive things within our sector, we do have to remember, obviously, there's huge amounts of activism in the world, and that kind of, we have to kind of, I think one of the ways to allay the fears of anxiety, because I mean, we've had students who have come as first year undergraduates and basically found out about the climate crisis through looking on the internet, and then are so anxious about it that even to discuss it has made them kind of leave the class. You know, it's kind of like they're that worried about it at one level, you know, which is amazing in the sense of that they feel it at that kind of level. And so it seems to me important that as much as we're trying to do the work within our sector, that we always remember that we have to try and work out ways to align it to the activism that's happening outside in society, and that is obviously, we presume, as the climate crisis grows, is going to become bigger and bigger, we hope, you know, and that is also a source of change. It's not that we've got to work out completely the way to decolonize university and get the Green New Deal in and it's all down to us, you know. It's that actually that if we build those social forces outside the university and inside, and there's a dialectic between the two, that will also force a change. Because really, obviously, we're really talking about going beyond capitalism, and that might seem crazy at the moment with the kind of Tory government we've got and things that are happening in the world, but that is what it's fundamentally about. It's about completely shifting the world's economy, isn't it? So we kind of got to kind of keep that kind of relation with the activism that's happening, you know, and I've been involved in huge things that have happened, and I'm sure lots of other people have. And I think that's a way to undermine the kind of possible personal anxiety that people feel, that this is a kind of 10, 20-year project. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, and people are working on it already for decades. You know, we have got to get there, but, you know, it's not everyone's personal responsibility right now, you know.
That's so helpful. I mean, because I do suffer from it. I get
panic
attacks, you know. But I take great comfort from things like the recent election result in Australia, where the fossil fuel incumbent government that just denied the existence of climate change, and they're chiseling through the Great Barrier Reef to open up for ships carrying coal, they've been thrown out. It shows that in some occasions, democracy can work, and that public concern can translate into action at the political, national level. And so maybe that can coalesce at international as well. So it's not just individual. I think that's a crucial thing. You're not alone in this. We are all struggling with this, and we might feel it in the lonely small hours, but actually coming together to share perspectives and apportion out work and look in a systemic way is the way forward, I think. Margot, did you want to join us for a moment? I know that you put something in the chat here.
Hi, my connection's not very good, so I'm not going to put my camera on. And actually, Noel just made a really kind of connected point, but it is about that sort of circularity with, it's something between what Jeremy said and what Noel said about where education and what we can do is about helping students to both kind of understand this. And this is where the kind of science-based element, I think, is absolutely fundamental. And we mustn't lose it, and we mustn't equate an understanding of science with an advocacy of technocratic solutions. And I know that's not what Jeremy was suggesting either, but I think there's a danger that those two things can get conflated. But, you know, yes, some students are coming to us straight away, absolutely well aware of this and very sort of highly informed, and other students aren't. And just that sort of question about what universities, what our sectors can do. And many people have kind of talked about this already, so I won't kind of reiterate, but part of what we can do is really help them understand and help mitigate this awful anxiety by acting.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Akhil, you did have your hand up, and then Rahul.
Yeah, mine was speaking to a previous point about the climate anxiety. I think that's a really important one. What I was going to say is, I think often, maybe there's something about decolonisation here, but like the way we as individuals and as institutions present, often it needs to be seen as perfect, like we're doing everything and we are sustainable, blah, 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 or you try and cover those things up. I think in a big polluters context, that's disingenuously done. But I think for universities in good faith, in some cases, there may be efforts, but as part of this unpicking, I think it's important to just say what's not possible and why, as long as that's transparent, and that might help people on obviously that has to be balanced with not pretending there's no need for radical change, but equally if one can't do it, just talking about that, communicating that with us, having that two-way dialogue might help some of these conversations rather than just a veneer of, you know, everything's being done, and that can then create unsustainable practices and commitments, like we talked about. Offsetting is one example, but yeah, definitely things around decolonisation here, I think, as well.
That's a crucial point, actually. And one of the things I've noticed, I've given a title to the orthodoxy of positivity, where it becomes really difficult in a competitive, professionalized environment to share anxiety or to express feelings of care, you know, of fear. Everybody has to always have something good to report. It's always going to be heading in the right direction, and we're on it and we've got it dealt with. And I think that is one of the contributing factors to the kind of epidemic of mental illness, because life doesn't consist simply of positive steps forward in the right direction. It consists of dealing with adversity, of recognizing insurmountable challenges, and acknowledging the limits of our ability to proceed. So it's really important as young adults are forming their place in a dangerous and uncertain world, that they recognize their own limitations without feeling defeated by the things they can't overcome. Who's next? I think we've got Rahul, and then Veronica and Meg.
Can we have Veronica and Meg first? If that's
Sure.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, well, bouncing off of Akhil's point and talking about the anxiety again, I think one thing I try to do in terms of, so I'm a visiting practitioner at the moment, and that means that I'm there I've been there for a few months with first years, and I think it's been really, really nice. One, because I can't help it, I'm very transparent, but when I've mentioned how essentially my experience of the university, again, doing a lot of work in decolonial context, climate justice, did also give me extreme anxiety, extreme exhaustion, and to some degree made me a complete cynic. But when I say that, they freak out. They're just like, okay, if you don't believe in anything, like, what does that say in terms of me looking towards you? But I think maybe I'm using the word wrong, but just kind of making it clear that at the same time, that cynicism is what galvanizes me into action. And it's more of a, if it's not going to work, why not try? You know, like reframing it like that. And I think that works. And sometimes maybe in terms of hierarchies that can develop in the studio, it's about kind of reshuffling them and meeting at the same level to also be a teacher. I think there's pockets of knowledge I don't have access to that the students very much do through their experience, their own reading, their independent research. And I think it's about encouraging them to trust that they can bring that conversation to the space, and they can, and it is valuable. And then another point I wanted to make while listening was also my personal experience in terms of funding. As someone who, yes, I teach, but also have a freelance practice, one of the most interesting but also painful experiences I've been having recently is seeking funding and realizing that you just, when you start to look at who is funding what, you just fall into this deep hole. And, you know, it can be quite, it's really hard to navigate. You know, you're seeking funding to support maybe certain communities, to platform certain communities, to have certain conversations, and then you find out that the funding has roots in practices that go completely against yours, and that brings up conversations about redistribution. And there's no right answers. I think maybe in terms of the way my identity intersects, it inherently will make anything I do on this island quite hard. But, you know, it's important to, again, have these conversations and understand that it will be difficult.
Thanks for sharing that, Veronica. It's so important to acknowledge the nature and the scale of the problems we face, rather than simply being determined to win. I think we've got Meg, and then perhaps Rahul make some concluding comments.
All right, just for fear of duplicating what anybody else has said, I totally agree with what people are saying around the concern around how it can contribute to eco-anxiety dependent on how climate and sustainability is integrated into learning. But it's important that it doesn't mean that people avoid it. I think it's about really considered approaches as to how climate and sustainability are integrated really meaningfully and relevantly in the context of academic disciplines, so that students can realize their potential to be agents for change, rather than maybe just having like a random module on the climate crisis, which the students can't realize their potential to be agents for change because it's not contextualized appropriately. And then also with that, creating spaces either within the formal curriculum or within that education institution, potentially through partnerships with the Students' Union, to also create spaces for students to be leaders for sustainability, for them to take action so that they can apply that learning into real, tangible, meaningful outcomes, rather than them just being like, now I've got this knowledge and I don't know what to do with it. It's really scary. It's about supporting the students to become agents for change. And that's not just what they learn, but it's also how they learn. So that's why I talked about education for sustainable development.
That's a really good point. I mean, we started framing this debate in terms of systems and structures, but what you've brought to the table collectively is the ethos and values. And I think that's absolutely crucial. And Meg's point about the Sustainable Development Goals raises a mechanism which I saw in the report, October 2018, on 1.5 degrees, where they set out the Sustainable Development Goals, but they didn't simply set them as things we should all aspire to. They recognized that there were tensions between them. And so they developed a mechanism which they called Synergies and Trade-Offs. And that recognizes that they're differently weighted, they've got different speeds they're moving at, and they also stand for different values that might represent conflicting interests. So the point is not simply to learn the facts, but to develop the ability to weigh up competing priorities and to take a position which is contingent in a given situation. And I think that's what higher education really does for people, above and beyond the specific knowledge they might gain from their discipline. But we're running close to time now, and I'd like to pass the mic to Rahul for some overview and concluding comments on today's discussion.
Thank you firstly everyone for joining, and thank you the panelists, because I thought the discussion was a required discussion and it moved it to another level in different ways. So each of the panelists provided very important points that we need to progress within the higher education sector. And when we conceived the series, both myself and David, we wanted a divergence of views within this discussion, and it wasn't going to be that we were all going to be in agreement with it. And I think we've had that, and we want that in the zine that we're producing. So I'm again making an appeal for contributions towards the zine. The deadline is the end of June, but the point I also wanted to make, and this is the very important kind of systemic issue, which I want to kind of phrase it, I want to use this phrase, green, but mostly white. Yeah, and when we conceived this series, you know, we were insistent that 50%, at least 50% of the speakers would be of color, right? The deficit that is there in the green movement is the words are said, but in practice it doesn't happen. And what we've shown is it can happen. It is possible to do that. And I think if there is one lesson for the four groups that are within the University of the Arts, and I'm sure there are replications of that in different forms across all the universities that are represented here, that we need to break that exclusion barrier of those people who are not white. So that's one important aspect in terms of this debate and this discussion. Secondly, is the one word that no one mentioned: profit, right? And that is the drive for climate disaster in all its kind of form, in a kind of microcosm way. So for example, I know when I go to Central St. Martin's, I see these signs everywhere, LVMH. Every time I organize and book a large lecture hall, I see big signage saying LVMH. Louis Vuitton, Mont Hennessy, you know, one of the largest fashion houses in the world, but also one of the largest producers of wine and champagne around the world. What is Louis Vuitton, Mont Hennessy proposing? That wine now comes in plastic bottles, right? Okay. Now, obviously, wine drinkers will be telling, oh, no way am I going to have that. Nevertheless, their reason for having this is that their profits have been hit because the fuel that they have to use to manufacture glass, you know, huge glass furnaces. Yes, we know those glass furnaces produce huge carbon, but for them, it's their profit that's been hit, transport costs and that, and therefore they want to produce this, produce wine into plastic. So question is the University of the Arts going to make a statement to say, you know, LVMH, no way, there are different solutions to it. If not, like the Black Lives Matter movement did to a whole series of football clubs, is we are going to de-recognize sponsorship to those organizations that do not adhere to anti-racist policies. Yeah, are the universities going to be taking the symbolic knee, in relation to these profit-driven companies that they're totally aligned to? So that's the key question, I think, in terms of that. And Jeremy was right. Capitalism, the first drive was through coal, steam. Second was through oil. Third, obviously, was through gas. And now, we've been told nuclear power is safe in that way. And there's a re-argumentation of that when we know in practice what takes place in relation to our planet. So capitalism is at the heart of it. And I don't think capitalism is going to be negotiating with anyone that comes into an argument which says, look, we have to make profit, tough, and that's why we're in this situation at the moment, because there's a reconfiguration taking place that war is good, armament sales are good, and of course it's all about oil, it's all about rechurning the oil lines across Europe. That is fine. Now climate change can take a second base. And in order to reconfigure that, we have to collectively mobilize. And I think, the kind of the groups that we are separated by, we have to think about mobilizing visually, in practice, in numbers, because that's what it took in 2019, in 2018, 2019, with Greta Thunberg's major call about mobilization. And I want to re-emphasize, although people have talked about 20 years, I'm sorry, there is a time factor that is seriously involved with the climate emergency.
I'm really sorry, but that's all we've got time for now. So once again, thank you to all our speakers and all our contributors. You've done a great job at moving a difficult debate a long way forward. Thanks very much, and we'll hope to see you again soon. Bye now.